The night I won my third Michelin star, I stood in the kitchen of my restaurant, Coeur, surrounded by my staff, tears streaming down my face. It was the highest honor in the culinary world, an achievement that only a handful of chefs could claim. I had worked for it my entire life, 15-hour days, bloody knuckles, destroyed relationships. Every ounce of my soul poured into every plate that left my kitchen. When the news came, I thought my life had reached its peak. I had no idea that I was standing at the edge of a cliff, and the people closest to me were about to push me off. My name is Valentina Moretti, and I built Coeur from nothing. I arrived in this city 20 years ago with $200 in my pocket and a dream in my heart. I worked as a dishwasher, then a line cook, then a sous chef, learning every station, every technique, every secret of the kitchen. When I finally opened my own restaurant, it was a tiny space with 12 tables and no reviews. But I cooked like my life depended on it, because it did. Slowly, painfully, I built a reputation. Critics noticed. Food lovers traveled from other cities just to taste my food. After 10 years, I got my first Michelin star. After 15, my second. And now, after 20 years of relentless, obsessive work, I had my third. The person I trusted most in the world was my partner, Julian Croft. He was my business manager, my confidant, the man who handled everything I couldn't. The finances, the contracts, the business side of the dream. We had been together for 12 years, partners in every sense of the word. He was there when I cried from exhaustion, when I doubted myself, when I wanted to give up. He believed in me when no one else did. He was my rock. He was also a thief. The problem started 6 months after the third star. I noticed discrepancies in our financial statements, small at first, then larger. Payments to vendors I didn't recognize, expenses that made no sense. I asked Julian about them, and he smiled that warm smile and assured me everything was fine. Just standard accounting, Valentina. Nothing to worry about. You focus on the food. Let me handle the numbers. I trusted him. I had always trusted him. Why would I stop now? Then came the inspection. Health department, unannounced. A surprise that never happens to 3-star restaurants. They found things I couldn't explain. Violations in the walk-in, expired products, sanitation issues that didn't exist the day before. I was shocked, confused, desperate to understand. The inspectors were cold, professional, unimpressed by my reputation. They shut us down. Temporarily, they said. Pending investigation. The news spread like wildfire. Within days, reservations were canceled, reviews turned negative. My reputation began to crumble. I turned to Julian for help, for support, for answers. He was gone. His office was empty, his phone disconnected, his apartment cleared out. In his desk, I found a single envelope with my name on it. Inside was a brief, cold letter. I'm sorry it had to end this way, but business is business. You were always the talent, but I was the brains. I've been planning this for years. The restaurant is mine now, along with everything else. You have nothing. Don't try to find me. I stared at the words, my mind refusing to process their meaning. He had done this. He had sabotaged my restaurant, stolen my money, destroyed my reputation, and vanished. The man I loved, the man I trusted, the man I had built my life with, was a con artist who had been planning my destruction since the day we met. The investigation revealed the full extent of his betrayal. He had been stealing from me for years, siphoning money into offshore accounts, taking out loans in my name, forging my signature on documents I never saw. The health department violations were his doing, paid for, arranged by someone who knew exactly where to strike. He had even cultivated relationships with food critics, planting seeds of doubt about my leadership, my stability, my sanity. By the time he disappeared, I had nothing left. The restaurant was closed, my accounts were frozen, my reputation was destroyed. I was 52 years old, broke, alone, and completely broken. I spent the next year in a fog of grief and rage. I moved into a tiny apartment, the kind I hadn't lived in since my 20s. I took a job at a diner, flipping eggs for minimum wage, hiding behind dark glasses, so no one would recognize the chef who had once been on magazine covers. At night, I would lie awake and replay every moment with Julian, searching for the clues I had missed. There were none. He was that good. He had played the role of the devoted partner so perfectly that even now, knowing the truth, I couldn't see the seams. Then one night I got a call. A former colleague, a food writer named Rebecca who had always been fair to me, told me she had seen Julian. He was in Chicago, she said, opening a new restaurant. Not under his own name, of course. He was using a different identity, a new persona, but she recognized him from old photos. He was calling himself Jean-Luc Moreau, a French culinary genius, with a mysterious past and a new restaurant called L'Horizon that was already generating buzz. He had taken everything from me, and now he was building a new life on the ruins of my reputation. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark for a long time. The grief, the rage, the despair, they didn't disappear. They transformed. They crystallized into something cold, something sharp, something patient. He thought he had won. He thought he had destroyed me and walked away clean. He didn't know me. He didn't know what I was capable of. I had built a 3-star restaurant from nothing. I had survived 20 years in a brutal industry. I had faced down critics, competitors, and my own demons. I was not going to let Julian Croft, or Jean-Luc Moreau, or whatever he called himself, get away with what he had done. I started planning that night. I would go to Chicago. I would find him. I would get close to him, the way he had gotten close to me. I would learn his new life, his new identity, his new weaknesses. And then, when the time was right, I would destroy him. Not with violence, not with confrontation, with something far more devastating. I would use the only weapon I had ever truly possessed, my talent. I would cook again. I would create dishes so extraordinary, so unforgettable, that they would eclipse everything he had ever done. I would remind the world who I was, and in doing so, I would expose him as the fraud he had always been. The hunt was on, and he had no idea what was coming. I arrived in Chicago on a gray November morning, the kind of cold, damp day that seeps into your bones and makes you question every decision you've ever made. I had sold everything I owned to fund this trip. My mother's jewelry, my furniture, even my collection of vintage cookbooks that had taken decades to accumulate. I had 2 suitcases, a fake ID, and a burning need for justice that kept me warm when the wind cut through my thin coat. I found a tiny studio apartment in a working-class neighborhood, the kind of place I hadn't lived in since my 20s. It was perfect. No one would look for Valentina Moretti here. Valentina Moretti was dead. I was someone else now. I spent the first month just watching. I would walk past L'Horizon at different times of day, studying the rhythm of the restaurant, the staff, the customers. I watched Julian, Jean-Luc, arrive each morning, confident and smiling, playing the role of the brilliant French chef. I watched him greet important guests, pose for photos, bask in the adulation he had stolen. I watched him and felt nothing. No rage, no sorrow, just a cold, quiet focus that sharpened with each passing day. I needed to get inside. Not as Valentina, but as someone he would never suspect. I created a new identity. Elena Rossi, a middle-aged line cook from Ohio, recently divorced, looking to start over in a new city. I had papers, references, a whole backstory fabricated over weeks of careful work. I applied for a job at L'Horizon, knowing they would be hiring as they built toward their grand opening. The sous chef who interviewed me was young, arrogant, clearly overwhelmed. He barely looked at my resume, barely asked any questions. He just needed warm bodies to fill the kitchen. I was hired within a week. Working at L'Horizon was a special kind of torture. I was in the same kitchen as the man who had destroyed me, breathing the same air, hearing his voice. He didn't recognize me. Why would he? I had aged, lost weight, cut my hair, changed everything about my appearance. To him, I was just another middle-aged cook, invisible, forgettable. I played the role perfectly, keeping my head down, doing my work, never drawing attention. But I was watching, always watching. I learned everything about his new operation. I learned that he was cutting corners, using inferior ingredients, passing them off as gourmet. I learned that he was mistreating his staff, screaming at them, firing them without cause. I learned that he was already planning his next move, scouting locations in other cities, building an empire on the foundation of lies and stolen money. He hadn't changed. He never would. The opportunity one needed came 3 months into my employment. L'Horizon was preparing for a VIP preview dinner, an invitation-only event for Chicago's most influential food critics, journalists, and restaurateurs. It was Julian's chance to make his mark, to establish himself as a major player in the city's culinary scene. It was also my chance to destroy him. I volunteered for every extra shift, every prep session, every late night. I wanted to be indispensable, to be everywhere, to know everything about the menu, the timing, the presentation. I studied each dish, each ingredient, each technique. I learned where the weaknesses were, where the potential for disaster lurked. And I began to plan. The night of the preview dinner, the kitchen was chaos. Julian was in his element, barking orders, inspecting every plate, playing the role of the genius chef. I was stationed at a corner station, doing prep work, seemingly unimportant. But I had positioned myself carefully. I was near the walk-in, near the supply shelves, near everything I needed. The first course was a delicate seafood dish, the kind that requires perfect timing and pristine ingredients. I had watched the prep cook prepare the components earlier that day. I knew where the extra portions were stored. I also knew that Julian had cut corners on the seafood, buying frozen instead of fresh, hoping no one would notice. I made sure they noticed. As the plates were being assembled, I subtly adjusted the temperature on the holding unit, ensuring the seafood would be slightly off, slightly disappointing. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to be noticed by the palates of the critics. The second course was a beef dish with a complex sauce that was Julian's signature. I knew the recipe intimately, had watched him prepare it dozens of times. I also knew that he had a weakness. He was inconsistent with his seasoning, relying on taste rather than measurement. That night, as he prepared the sauce, I made sure his tasting spoon was contaminated with salt, throwing off his palate. He overseasoned the entire batch without realizing it. The beef was beautiful. The sauce was a disaster. The third course was a dessert that required precise plating and careful presentation. The pastry chef was young, talented, and completely intimidated by Julian. I had befriended her over the weeks, earned her trust, learned her fears. That night, as she was plating the final desserts, I made a small comment, a tiny suggestion that threw off her rhythm. She hesitated, lost focus, and botched the plating on 3 of the most important dishes. Julian exploded, screaming at her in front of everyone. The pastry chef ran out of the kitchen in tears. The desserts were never properly finished. By the end of the night, the preview dinner was a disaster. The critics were polite, but their reviews the next day were devastating. Promising but inconsistent. A chef who hasn't yet found his footing. Disappointing execution from a kitchen that promised so much. Julian's grand opening, scheduled for the following week, was postponed indefinitely. Investors pulled out. Reservations were canceled. Laurizon, his dream, his new identity, was dying before it ever had a chance to live. I watched from the shadows as his world crumbled, and I felt something I had not felt in years, satisfaction. Not joy, not triumph. Just the quiet, deep satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly. He had taken everything from me. Now I had returned the favor. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. The next phase was more personal. I reached out to the journalists who had covered my fall, the ones who had written those damning articles about my restaurant, my reputation, my life. I sent them anonymous tips, documents, evidence of Julian's true identity. I told them about the stolen money, the forged signatures, the years of fraud. I gave them everything I had gathered during my months inside his operation. They investigated, verified, and published. The story was a bombshell. Renowned chef Jean-Luc Moreau exposed as fraud. The man behind Laurizon is Julian Croft, wanted for embezzlement. The news spread like wildfire. Within days, he was a pariah. His investors abandoned him. His staff quit. His restaurant closed. He tried to run, of course. He always ran. But I was ahead of him. I had tipped off the authorities, given them his location, his aliases, his patterns. They picked him up at the airport, trying to flee to South America with what little money he had left. I watched the news coverage of his arrest, his perp walk, his face splashed across every screen. He looked broken, confused, completely undone. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I didn't attend the trial. I didn't need to. I had done my part. The prosecutors had my evidence, my testimony, my years of documentation. He was convicted on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. He received 15 years in federal prison. 15 years to think about what he had done, about the lives he had destroyed, about the woman he had underestimated. After it was over, I went back to my tiny studio and sat in the dark for a long time. I thought about my restaurant, my career, my life before Julian. I thought about the 3 Michelin stars, the magazine covers, the adoring reviews. I thought about the 20 years I had poured into Coeur, all of it gone, all of it stolen. I thought about the man I had loved and trusted, the man who had destroyed me. and I thought about what came next. I didn't know. For the first time in years, I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a goal. I didn't have a purpose. The hunt was over. The revenge was complete. And I was left with nothing but memories and a strange, hollow emptiness. Then one day I got a letter. It was from a young chef in Chicago, a woman who had read about my story, who had followed the news, who had been inspired by what I had done. She was opening a small restaurant, she wrote, and she wanted to know if I would consult. Not as a head chef, not as a celebrity, just as someone who knew food, who understood the kitchen, who could help her avoid the mistakes that had destroyed me. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. Then I picked up the phone and called her. That was 5 years ago. Today, her restaurant has 2 Michelin stars. She gives me credit in every interview, calls me her mentor, her inspiration. I don't cook anymore, not professionally. My hands are too damaged, my heart too scarred. But I consult, I teach, I pass on everything I learned to the next generation. Julian took my restaurant, my reputation, my career. But he didn't take my knowledge, my passion, my love for food. Those are mine forever. He's still in prison, with years left on his sentence. I don't think about him much anymore. He's not worth the mental energy. I have new chefs to mentor, new dishes to create, new dreams to nurture. The signature dish of my life was never any single plate of food. It was the resilience to rise from the ashes, to keep cooking, to keep creating, to keep living. And that, more than any Michelin star, is a legacy worth having.